I hope that many of us would know by heart the first commandments. I don't know about you all, but I was required to know them, memorize, and list them when I went to Catholic school. If we don't do that, by the way, we really should start doing it. So remind me to have a teachers' meeting this week. But the very first commandment is, I am the Lord your God, and you shall have no gods before me. Now, at the time of Moses, this was very literal. There was a problem of the Israelites worshiping the Egyptian gods. And then we kind of didn't get over that. We started worshiping the Babylonian gods. And then many of the Christians at the time of Jesus started worshiping the Roman gods. And I think for most of us, this is not a struggle these days, although pantheism and so-called neo-paganism made a brief comeback in the late 90s, early 2000s. But I think for most of us, this is not how we might struggle with this commandment. I mean, none of you have ever been invited to the First Church of Poseidon Reformed, have you? No one goes there, right? You don't have friends knocking on your door inviting you. Would you like to participate in the cult of Baal this morning? Hi, I'd like to share with you a little bit about Zeus, my Lord and Savior. We don't really see that going on, although it happens. I mean, like I said, the neo-paganism made it. When I was a kid, it was really cool to be Wiccan or to be Norse pagan. You kind of saw these things, and we certainly see it in terms of New Age. People who think that Christians are crazy, but will call a psychic to come and bless their house, or people who think that our beliefs of praying for the dead are ridiculous, but they'll pay some medium to come and talk to their grandfather for them and relay messages. And certainly in our particular area of our parish, we have people who practice voodoo and Santeria and maybe some of these other synchronized religions where something other than God is being given power. And so in that sense, we do literally fight against this commandment. But I think most of us, for our idols, are not things that we are literally worshiping, burning incense before, or seeing as a spiritual priority in our lives. Instead, I think we turn to what St. Thomas Aquinas classifies as our favorite substitutes for God. The favorite substitutes for God by human beings are money, power, pleasure, and fame. Now, none of those things in and of themselves are bad. None of them are bad things at all. Some of them are even things that are necessary in society. Money, we need money. You got to have commerce in order to live. And some say, well, the Bible says that money is the root of all evil. Actually, it doesn't. St. Paul says the love of money is the root of all evil. In other words, if we are showing the affection towards money, and if money is occupying the place in our heart that should be for our ultimate love, God, then something's out of whack. Something's wrong. And that leads to a lot of problems. We see this stuff even happening within the church sometimes. Right? And there's nothing wrong with power. Politics. Politics are necessary in society. It's necessary to have people who govern other people in order to keep the peace. In fact, St. Paul tells us to pray for kings and those in authority. And there's nothing wrong with pleasure in and of itself, right? The love of the intimacy between husband and wife should be something that you enjoy. It's okay to enjoy a good meal. It's okay to enjoy a good movie, a good book, all of these things. But if any of these things start taking precedence over how God intended them to be in our lives, then that thing becomes an idol. Sexual pleasure certainly is a favored idol in our culture today. St. Paul talks about that a lot in the book of Romans, how we look for natural relations and then unnatural relations, and now some really unnatural stuff. Oh my goodness. Anyway, but I'm actually not talking about any of those things this morning. And the last one is money, power, pleasure, right? The last one is what I'm going to talk about, fame. Fame, or we could even call it popularity or glory. This tends to be a huge distraction. And again, there's nothing wrong with being liked. I think to a certain degree in all of our lives, it's healthy. We have this healthy longing for the affection, for the esteem of other people. But the problem is, one, when we start having unrealistic expectations on that person, and two, when we substitute a relationship or the affection of a human being for the love of God in our lives. The reality, my brothers and sisters, is the only one who ever loves us perfectly is God. That's it. That's it, and that's all. I look out, I see a lot of happy married couples. And I got to tell you, though, no matter how wonderful, amazing, and or gorgeous and handsome your husband or wife is, they will love you imperfectly at some point. At some point, we all have bad days. We all have moments of weaknesses. We all have moments where we decide to choose ourselves and not the other person in front of us. Some of us have had amazing relationships with our parents. Some of us have had not so great relationships with our parents. Some of us are amazing parents, and some of us recognize that there have been struggles in the way that we have related to our own children. And the reality is that as much as your parents love you, as much as they strive to always do what's best for you, at some point, your father or your mother is going to love you imperfectly. They're going to have a bad day where you have asked one too many questions. You're going to have wrecked the car and called them at 1 o'clock in the morning. You're going to have those moments of trial and hardship, and sometimes we don't always respond perfectly. And then what do? But we expect our parents to be perfect all the time. And when we expect that level of perfection, that perfect love that we can only get from God, and then we don't find it, we become severely upset and disappointed. And sometimes it even requires years of therapy. I say it laughing, but it's the truth, right? I mean, how often times in my own life have I realized that I'm upset with another person because they have not lived up to unrealistic expectations I have put on them in my head. You're supposed to do this and you didn't. You're supposed to be perfect and you weren't. How dare you be flawed and human? But we should only expect that perfect love to come from God, because only God is ever going to satisfy the longing in our heart that we have for perfect and absolute unconditional love. Now, hopefully, the rest of us are striving to get there. We do it to priests all the time, too. In case you have not heard this, let me tell you right now, I am imperfect. Very much so. All you have to do is ask anyone who interacted with me yesterday evening. And most people who interact with me before noon. I'm trying. I'm a work in progress. I'm broken. And I know I've been hurt by and they don't even mean to. We don't even mean to. Father can say good morning to someone the wrong way. Father hates me. I just said good morning. It happens to all of us. And so my point is that we really need to learn to accept that perfect love from God, and then we won't be so disappointed when the affection and esteem of other people falls short. I remember when I was young, I was reading the biography of one of my favorites, if not perhaps my favorite saint, St. Francis of Assisi. And in one of his biographies, there's a story, it's in one of his most ancient accounts of his life, is a story called The Perfect Joy of St. Francis. And Francis is walking along with his brothers after a day of preaching the gospel and begging in the streets and doing, all those fun and exciting things that Franciscans do. And he says, brothers, if we were to become so educated and perfect in the ways of science and literature that the brothers became the most excellent teachers in all the world, that would not be perfect joy. He said, if we preach the gospel in such an effective way that countless souls were turned to Christ because of our preaching, that would not be perfect joy. Which, of course, led the brothers to beg the question, then, Brother Francis, what is perfect joy? He said, perfect joy would be if we were to return to our home tonight, and our brother porter who answers the door would say, who are you, you wicked, wretched beggars? Get off my lawn. I don't know you. And the more that we insisted, but brother, you know us, you love us, we're your friends. And the more he yelled at us, the more he insulted us, the more he chastised us. And then eventually he beat us with a knotted stick and left us to sleep outside in the cold and wet snow. And we were able to rejoice at suffering for the sake of the gospel. Then that would be perfect joy. And I remember when I was a young person and I read that, I said, wow, this has to be the stupidest thing I've ever read in my life. It seemed so nonsensical to my young mind at the time. But I have to say that as I've grown, certainly in stature, hopefully in wisdom, I've come to realize what St. Francis is talking about. If we, my brothers and sisters, get to a point in our life where we are so completely and entirely divorced from the thoughts and the esteem of others, that would be such freedom, such happiness. If I could just be set completely free from worrying what somebody else is going to think of me. And I don't mean that in the sense of, I don't care what anyone thinks, so let me be the perfect, beep beep to everyone. But in the sense of, I'm only worried about pleasing God. That is where one finds perfect joy. We're a little bit past the halfway point through the Gospel of Mark. And Jesus is talking to his disciples. He's now making the second declaration. So you remember last week, St. Peter identified, you are the Christ, which is kind of a central point of this gospel. The gospel begins with, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So Peter declares that truth, you are the Christ. And then Jesus says, you got it, Peter, and starts to talk about his passion, his death, and even his resurrection, and Peter was not here for it. So now, they're all moving along the way, going to Jerusalem, passing through Capernaum where they've been before, and Jesus tells them again, by the way, the Son of Man's going to be handed over to men, and they're going to kill him, and he will rise. Now notice that he didn't tell them a story, he didn't tell them a parable. He was speaking to them very clearly and very plainly, and they still didn't get it. In fact, at this point, they all got quiet. Probably because they were scared to ask questions after Peter got called Satan, But all of a sudden, what do? They want to change the subject. And what's our favorite things to change the subject to? Ourselves. So they started having this argument, this discussion about who was the best. Now, I wonder, who was the best what? Who was the best fisherman? Who was the best golfer? Okay, they didn't have golf, but I imagine they had something similar that people played. Maybe they were all mad at St. John because John's always like, I'm the one who Jesus loves more than anyone else. And they said, be quiet, John, this is Mark's gospel. Maybe that's what the argument was about. I don't know, but I know that they ended up having this who's the most popular, who's the best. And isn't that our life? How much of our life do we spend comparing ourselves to other people? In our work, in our relationships, even with our families, among siblings, husbands and wives saying, who gives more in this direction? Adult siblings to parents, our school lives. All the time, we're constantly doing this. And it's because we've been programmed in this society that it's kind of a rat race, that there's kind of a ladder, and you have to be at this certain place on the ladder. And if you're not one step above someone else in the ladder, then there's something wrong with you. Jesus came to turn that ladder upside down. He came to completely shatter and ruin our worldview. This week I was on retreat, which I was very blessed to do. But retreat requires sacrifices. And one of mine is missing Jeopardy. Because I have become that kind of man. I have become my father. But a friend of mine sent me a text on Tuesday night, said, hey, I want to let you know that there's a priest on Jeopardy right now. So last night I watched the Jeopardy because I whatever you call DVRing these days, I DVR'd it. Because I have my Jeopardy set to DVR normally, because again, that's the kind of man I've become. And there's a priest, and by the way, this priest is trending on social media as #hotpriest. Again, I affirm that I was on retreat. I was not on Jeopardy. But of course I wanted to watch because I want to see how this priest was doing. And of course I was rooting, for the priest the whole time. And Father did all right, although he missed one question that I would have gotten right, but that's okay. And he ended up, he came in last place. But he was doing pretty good for a while. But you know what Ken Jennings said to him when he took last place? He said, but Father, as you know, the last shall be first. Now, isn't that amazing? The amazing coincidence in all of providence, as if the producers of Jeopardy had any clue that that was going to air the Thursday before this was the gospel that was proclaimed. So, Father, wherever you are, you proclaimed this gospel today, and you had to be thinking, right? He had to be thinking of his role on Jeopardy. But what a beautiful testimony to humility, because this guy was newly ordained. So, we think that we've spent all this time in education and learning all of these things, and what a great way to be reminded we don't have to be great in the ways of the world. And this particular priest belongs to a religious community, which I could tell by the symbol he was wearing. And so he takes a vow of poverty, so I imagine the money would have gone to the community or to a charity or something like that. Anyway, so he really didn't care about being esteemed in the eyes of the world. And this is where Jesus wants to remind his friends, his disciples, that he's come to turn the world upside down. He's come to shatter their worldview. He's come to tear apart their preconceived notions of what greatness and grandeur are. And he picks up a child. Now, we've really come a long way in the past 200 years or so. That we are a society and a culture that really esteems and loves children, as is evident by all the beautiful noises I'm hearing in the church today. But it wasn't always like that in society as a whole. At the time of Jesus and in the ancient Near East and in the Mediterranean culture, children were completely ignored many times, as were women. A lot of times, treated as second-class citizens. Why? Because your value was in what you could contribute to the community, which in those days meant mostly physical abilities. What was your trade? How many fish can you catch? How many, animals can you kill? How many vegetables can you sell? And so children were seen as almost less than human beings in society. Luckily, we've come a long way of that. A lot of saints played the way in this. If you look at Saint John Bosco, one of my favorite saints as well, his preventative method in education revolutionized the way we approach education today, because he had this crazy idea that if you really want to teach a child, you should make them feel loved. Can you imagine that was innovative, creative, new? The idea that we should make children feel loved? But we lived in a world where the infant mortality rate was high, where many children were born still. And so I think a lot of people had this idea of, we'll get attached to them later. And so Jesus took a child that had probably been running around the room that none of them had ever really noticed or paid any attention to, and said, if you wish to be the first, you got to learn to be the last. In other words, if you really want to be great in the kingdom of God, you have to learn to let go of the fake love that this world offers us, of the esteem of people and individuals, and instead learn to see the things that are important to God. And he says, look at this little child. Whoever receives the least, receives one like this, receives me. In other words, Jesus is saying, if you really want to give me honor, then you got to honor these children. And not just children, which we do honor children. We love children here, right? We're celebrating the beautiful baptism of these two beautiful young ladies today. But beyond that, what about those who our modern society has deemed unimportant, less human? Of course, right now with Amendment 4 in our mind, the most obvious one to me is the unborn. 96% of biologists from every political persuasion across the spectrum and from different academic institutions have determined and said and agree that human life begins at fertilization, or what we would call conception. 96% of them. Yet, the majority of them also believe that it's okay to terminate that human life. We've decided that certain human beings have more rights than others. The last time we had something like that in this nation was slavery. But we're not just a one-issue church. That one's glaring to me because of everything that's going on right now. But there's others. How do we treat people from different socioeconomic classes than us when we encounter them? If you want to test this, go to Walmart. How patient are you with the people around? How patient are you with someone who doesn't speak your language well, who doesn't look like you, dress like you, behave like you? Are you quick to judge? Are you quick to discard? Are we quick to dismiss them? How do we handle people of different religious persuasions? We disagree with a lot of stuff, but do we love them as Christ loves them? People with an immigration status that's different than ours. Are we truly loving them? Are we truly seeing them as Christ sees them, or are we trying to fit them into a stereotype, into a caricature that advances our political agendas? The elderly, those who suffer from dementia. Do we just dismiss them and pretend they don't exist, or do we recognize their dignity, their value, their worth? People suffering from mental disorders, the neuroatypical or the neurodivergent, people who don't think as we do. Are we treating them with dignity and respect? People suffering from addictions, do we get just angry and frustrated with them and want to ignore them? How do we treat someone who asks us for money at a gas station? I fly off the handle sometimes because I get so tired of it. But am I really treating that person with dignity, respect, and love? I'm not saying you always have to give money if you don't, especially if you can't afford it, but are we showing them love? Are we respecting their dignity? I hope that someone in the church today, I hope that everyone in the church today was challenged by at least one of these questions. Because that's what Jesus does. His gospel is challenging. His gospel calls us to step out of our comfort zones. The gospel, in a sense, today is about turning our worldview upside down and shattering our preconceptions. Recognizing that the latter does not make sense to God. That Christ died so that every human being may be seen as one created in the image and likeness of God. And so the challenge, my dear friends, to each one of us this morning is, are we going to allow Jesus to turn our worldview upside down, to shatter our preconceived judgments, and to open our eyes to see his face in every woman, man, and child that we encounter? Or are we going to be unchanged and go back to being the way we were before? He's come to turn it upside down. He's come to make it topsy-turvy. And this is why he tells us truly, the last will be first.